I was a professional cyclist for years, and I ate a traditional sports nutrition, high sugar, high salt diet. Um, and I retired when I was 38 because I was just getting sick all the time, and couldn't figure out why I was getting sick. The doctors couldn't figure out why I was getting sick. And I just went, I'm just getting old. I can't handle this sort of level of training. So I went back to school, went to CSU, and one of my first classes was with Dr. Cordain. And having learned traditional sports nutrition, I sat there in the class and I was angry. I was like, this guy's full of it. Could not believe what he was saying. Was so angry, I spent the summer after that class trying to prove him wrong. And in the course of trying to prove him wrong, I'd go through the science and go, well, that makes sense. But this can't be right. And then I'd go through the science and go, well, actually, that makes sense too. And slowly over time, I ended up on the paleo diet without even knowing it. And that winter was the winter I was, so I was 38. And all of a sudden, I wasn't getting sick anymore. And even though I was a full-time student, I was training better and harder than I had in years. I went to Canadian Nationals on my 39th birthday and missed third place by a wheel length. And actually, the next year, went back to racing pro. And briefly that year, I was ranked, at the age of 40, I was ranked top 10 in America. And, I'm not as fast as I used to be, but, I did a professional race down in the Caribbean 2 months ago at the age of 53. So that, for me, the evidence of the diet for me, and that was entirely the diet. It gave me many more years of being able to race, of being healthy, of just no longer having all these illness issues. That turned me into the convert. And that's why this is my diet for the rest of my life.
Trevor Connor and Dr. Griffin McMath, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
Thanks for having us. We've been looking forward to this.
I am so thrilled to have you here today. So we have a lot to cover, and you guys are here to talk about the paleo diet and so much more. And folks may remember hearing about the paleo diet. It's like it exploded onto the scene about a decade ago. And I want to ask you, why is the paleo diet more important now than ever?
I have a bunch of reasons why I think it's really important now. The one I'm going to start with is you are seeing more and more dietary movements right now. And what I'm seeing with them is they're getting more extreme. They're getting more, very particular direction. Cut carbohydrates completely out of your diet. Cut this completely out of your diet. The paleo diet started as a diet that was based on science. We are much more, believe it or not, in the middle, moderate. We are about, you eat an omnivore diet. We don't have you need to cut all carbs or cut all fat or all protein. We don't even actually have a macronutrient ratio. We're really about what people talked about with nutrition even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, which is what are the foods that are healthy for you, what are not. So I think it's really important right now as you're seeing this kind of making diets more and more extreme, just having a diet that's based on science that doesn't go to these huge extremes that you're seeing right now.
I think I would even add to that too, in 2024, we're more aware of our environmental impact than ever with so many different choices we make, both on the plate and off the plate. More people are concerned about our soil health, about nutrient density. More people are concerned about budget of and how to go about meals and how to feed a family and how to feed people with a multitude of dietary preferences or restrictions. And I think what to me is so exciting about the work we do with the paleo diet is that it ends up being one of the best home-based diets that if people understand how to cook and how to shop for, you're most likely being more friendly to the planet. You're most likely being more friendly to the overall state inside your body because you've stuck to shopping around the perimeter of the grocery store, especially because the conversation about ultra-processed foods is so rampant right now. This is one of the OG dietary guidelines that people are familiar with that stays away from that, so I think that's why.
I did an interview about 5 years ago, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name right now, but it was one of the higher ups at the USDA who is helping to write the standards, USDA standards for diet. And I read an interview where she was pretty critical of the paleo diet. So I reached out and said, would you do an interview with me? And talked with her for about an hour. And for most of the interview, we were in complete agreement. We talked about nutrient density. She's like, yes, we need more nutrient dense foods. We need less processed foods. We were kind of agreeing on everything. So I finally just at the end of it went, so what's your issue with the paleo diet? And she goes, and by the way, for anybody who's interested, this is on our website. Go read it. It was a fascinating interview. But at the end of it, I said, what's your issue? And she goes, you don't have a macronutrient ratio, which is the ratio of carbohydrates to fat to protein. I went, right, because we're all about what foods you should eat, and the macronutrient ratio is flexible. And she goes, yeah, I'm not okay with that. How can we compare you to other diets if you don't have the ratio?
It's like the RCT debate.
Yes.
Fascinating. I wonder if the cavemen had that.
Well, this is the point I've made. Find it, I guarantee you in the entire history of the Paleolithic era, there was never somebody who was handed a piece of fruit and said, no, thank you, I'm watching my carbs.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the thing. It feels like this diet has stood the test of time. And it feels like when you peel back the layers of whatever new diet that has a new name, that sort of like has a new study behind it, and you actually look at what foods that diet contains that seem to be health promoting, it's the core foods that are being promoted by the paleo diet. And so for those who aren't familiar, let's start with, what the paleo diet is. What is this style of not just eating, but even the paleo lifestyle that you guys have dedicated your lives to making sure more people know about?
I always start really simple and then let people kind of ask me questions and I can give more information. But to me, any good idea can be simplified down to one sentence. And the paleo diet in one sentence is eat lots of vegetables, fruits, fish, healthy meats, and sparingly nuts and seeds. That is a diet in a nutshell. And when people hear that, they go, well, that's kind of what I was taught in kindergarten. I go, exactly. It's just eating nutrient-dense, natural foods. That is what the diet is about. It's that simple.
Brilliant. And Dr. McMath, so what is excluded from the paleo diet?
We're talking legumes and grains, certain oils, any dairy would be a no. So as much as Trevor just made a comment about eating healthy meats and eating fish, it is possible to have a vegan diet and vegan lifestyle and still eat paleo. So I think that's an important note there as well. We do not add processed foods into the diet, and we exclude added processed sugars. There's a small amount of, raw honey or a small amount of maple syrup that sneaks in once in a while. And added salt, we really stick away from as well.
I will tell you, honestly, the thing we get criticized for is the elimination of grains and dairy, because those are actually very recent additions to the human diet. And I am happy to go deep into the science of why both of those are an issue. But I will tell you, the thing that people struggle with the most are sugar and salt. Because they are, there's lots of research in this. Those are the two things that people crave the most. And you talk to anybody who's in food science, and food science is different from nutrition. Nutrition is about what's healthy. Food science is about how do you produce products. And anybody in food science will tell you, you want to make something that will just fly off the shelves, add salt, add sugar, because that's what people want. And people always ask, so why is it that we love these things that are bad for us? And the answer is we need them. We need them in small quantities. And during the time that we were evolving, these things were actually quite rare. It was much harder to find carbohydrates and simple sugars. It was much harder to find salt. So we evolved to build a taste for them so that when we encountered them, we didn't walk by, we ate them, because you didn't know when you were going to encounter a good salt source again. Problem that we have now is they're readily available. So we put a ton in our food and it's way more than we need.
So let me ask you guys this. How has the paleo diet developed? I know there's a robust body of science that supports the foods that are included and excluded. What's the story behind how the paleo diet came to be?
So Dr. Cordain was the originator. He was a professor at CSU. And let me tell you, he is a scientist through and through. When I took over the business from him, he handed me his financial Excel sheets, and he had null hypothesis. in the in the Excel document. I read that. I couldn't stop laughing. Like he can only think in terms of science. But he was more on the exercise fitness side. And he was a runner. He was a pretty serious runner and wanted to figure out how to improve his diet to help his running. So he just started on the side reading the research on nutrition and got more and more excited about it. And over 15 years of reading the science, which led him to people like Dr. Boyd Eaton, who were really kind of coming up with this whole Paleolithic idea. At the end of all this, Dr. Cordain just said, this is what the science shows. And his wife encouraged him to write a book, and they did. And what I always laugh about is the original title of the book was, so I remember it was A More Natural Human Diet Based on Paleolithic Ethnographic Data, to which the publishers just said, no, we're not calling it that, and retitled it The Paleo Diet.
Yeah. Good call. I love that. And so how did he discover, I mean, what was the basis that he used to kind of come up with these principles as he was digging into the research and the science?
So he was really influenced, as I said, by the research of Dr. Boyd Eaton, who was really looking at this idea of what is the more natural diet, what were we designed around? And so Dr. Cordain just jumped in that and really looked at what were we eating 20,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, and then he got very interested. So what are the foods that we have introduced since then? And what's the health impact of them? When he started diving into those foods that have been introduced since, and if you read Dr. Cordain's original study, he talks about the fact that 70% of the foods we eat now have only really been in our diet for a couple hundred years. And then you look at the health impacts of those foods and you go, those really should never have been introduced, not in the sort of quantities we're eating them. I'm sorry, I've been jumping all over this, Griffin.
No, I mean, honestly, I just think about some of the, the arguments that can come up against some of the things you're saying. And it makes me smile when you say not in the quantities that we typically are, because, and as much as we're proponents of the guidelines that we just mentioned, Trevor and I talk about kind of what we eat, what that's not paleo that we have once in a while. And if you're going to do it, just do it right. You don't have to try to get some highly processed alternative, that just do it. And we do have these 85-15 guidelines now that I think a lot of people aren't familiar with, and really allow you to live your life in a more balanced way. I know that if pizza didn't exist completely, but I knew it existed, I would be so sad. So, in moderation, or not even in moderation, in an appropriate quantity for what that particular thing is, right? We know about the concept of a poison, depends on the dose, right? For a lot of different things. And so going back to something else he said about sugar and salt being so difficult for people, we tend now, our palates are so used to such an excessive amount of that when it's deficient in that, we tend to add even more. So, in the restaurant industry or in sugary sweets, they get packed in. We're so used to adding more that when people start to pull away, sometimes people even start to feel kind of crud, like not so great for the first 10 to 14 days of going paleo or starting to eat within the paleo dietary guidelines. And so, dose is really important. But again, these last few hundred years, as we've kind of become this globalized, industrialized world, these different ingredients were never really meant to be consumed at the rate and the quantity that we do now.
They are addictive foods. And I know you have a lot of doctors who listen to your show, and so they'll understand this. Look at the example of alcohol. There's plenty of arguments that drinking a little bit of alcohol every once in a while can actually be beneficial for you. And there is research backing that. But the problem you always have with anything that's addictive is as you drink or eat it more regularly, it starts to lose its effect unless you start having more and more and more. And that's what you see with people when they drink alcohol, is they have to drink more and more alcohol to get the benefit. So we call it building a tolerance. And it can go to bad places where somebody could become an alcoholic. And then you go, now it's doing damage to your body. There's no benefits to this. You're harming your body. and they have to learn how to pull back. And it's the same thing with a lot of these foods we eat. Sugar and salt are highly addictive. You eat in small quantities. Yes, it's essential for our survival, but we have this ability now to add more and more to our diet. And as you eat more and more, you get desensitized to it. So you have to have increasingly more to get the benefits, to get the high, to get the feels that you want from it. And that's where we're at. We're eating way too much, and it's just having huge health consequences.
I think it's not just about quantity either. It's about frequency, right? If something is consumed, and I really don't like the wording of this, but it's a phrase that most people are familiar with, the concept of a cheat day, right? Like, cheat should not be anywhere near our lexicon when it comes to food. But if you think about the concept of a cheat day where you kind of commit on a consistent level to a very intentional nutrition for most of a week, let's use a week time frame, and then you get to your last day and you say, and today I can just live my life. There is something different that happens within the body when your body is only, it sounds dramatic, but like bombarded or has to be burdened with those ingredients once, rather than if your body gets used to constantly having to deal with it. There's this low key chronic drip. And that's when your body starts to say, oh, so this is okay. Like, this is the kind of dose that I should be having at all times. And then, then we start to see a ripple effect from that. So there is something not just about the quantity, but if this is something that appears that every single time you're consuming something, you can't have a coffee without all of the added, syrups and sugars. Your breakfast is a pastry with a lot of icing on it. And at lunch, it's this loaded, I was about to say a sandwich, but actually it sounds really good right now, or a certain type of sandwich. And I'm like, that sounds great. But if every single meal you're introducing these really inflammatory ingredients, then it's always happening. So as much as I don't like the phrase cheat day, and we should really work on rebranding that, there is something about not just the quantity that you're having, but the frequency as well.
So let me actually give an example of that I'm experiencing today. So I've been traveling the last few days, and I was just down in upstate New York staying with some friends. And to be blunt, my friends do not eat healthy. They have pizza every night or some sort of junk food like that. And I was staying with them for 3 nights and just went, they're treating me. They're letting me stay at their house. This is not the place to start arguing nutrition. So I had pizza for dinner 3 nights in a row. And saw 2 effects of this. One is I woke up this morning just going, oh, like it was tough getting out of bed, which normally isn't that tough for me. But the other thing was I walked downstairs and I was just like, where's the pizza? I need more pizza. After 3 days, it's just the cravings hit you. Where like I love pizza. As Griffin said, I have it about once every 2 weeks. I love it. I get the greasiest pizza possible. As I said, I don't try to get the gluten-free or anything else and thoroughly enjoy it. But that once every 2 weeks, I'm fine. The next day I'm satisfied and I move on. But after 3 days in a row, it's completely different. It's, as Griffin said, it's that frequency. Now, really important thing, this is the one criticism I've heard of the paleo diet that I agree with. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about it. Most of those foods don't exist anymore. We have modified fruits. We have modified animals. So we're trying to approximate the foods that we ate then, but the possibility of eating exactly the way we did in those times doesn't exist anymore.
Katie, you said something about agriculture and kind of like, oh, as soon as agriculture came, this change. I studied anthropology as my undergraduate degree, and when you study anthropology, you study all the different fields as an undergrad. And I remember having a biological anthropology professor who hated the paleo diet. And this is around the time where like the paleo diet really came up. And college was so long ago, but it's one of the most vivid memories of lecture that I have, which interestingly enough, I would then go on to work in the paleo diet. But she went on this rant, and then she talked about it, and she struggled with the name of the, she got really stuck on some of the details about the name and the period. And, you heard what Trevor said earlier about, well, the original book that he put together was this mouthful of things. And so sometimes the names of diets just kind of exist because it's easy to get that message around. But the other anthropology professor and lecture that I remember the most was this wonderful man who came in, looked at all of us. I think it was like the first lecture, And he just said the moment that agriculture came was like the death to society. I remember everyone looked around and it was just like day one, the beginning of college. Thought this is going to be really amusing. But he proceeded to have this lecture and he went really into it. And we talked about hunter and gatherers and we talked about, the impact on the land. We talked about the impact on human health. And thank goodness today we have such an amazing movement of those who tend to the land for regenerative agriculture and to say, okay, well, if this is what we're going to do, let's do it right. So I want to make sure that when we talk about agriculture now, that we really honor the work of people who are saying there's a better way we can do it. So though we have introduced agriculture in a blink of a time across human evolution, we already have some really amazing people who are tending to at least some of the drawbacks and using it as an opportunity to do better. But unfortunately, when it comes to ultra processed foods or food availability, that's really hard to do in a really quick period, especially with the supply chain that we have. So agriculture, yes, but I would put an asterisk that we do have an opportunity and we have the know-how now to adjust that. And thankfully, there's a really great workforce doing it.
That's a great point. And I think when I say agriculture, I think a lot of what I think of is the sort of mass production of cereal grains. And so I know that a lot of what the paleo diet excludes is cereal grains, as well as dairy, which tends to come from animals who are raised, right, and available for producing dairy. And so why are those two things excluded on the paleo diet? What's the thinking behind that? Besides the fact that maybe they weren't naturally occurring in a ton of supply, 20,000 years ago. What's the science behind why that would actually make sense for health?
I'll start with grains. There is a reason that we only started eating grains very recently, and it's because we needed to develop processing first. If you went into a wheat field and tried to eat unprocessed raw wheat, you'd get violently sick. It has a huge number of anti-nutrients in it that has really negative impacts on our health. And there's a very logical explanation for this. All life wants to protect itself. Animals can fight or run away. Plants can't do that. They needed to develop another way to protect themselves. And in the case of grains, they developed anti-nutrients. That's not the case of all plant life. Another completely different example that's a great one is fruit. Fruit's very healthy for us. And it's because actually those plants developed a symbiotic relationship with us where they put an indigestible seed inside something that tastes really good because they want the fruit to be eaten. You eat the animal will eat the fruit. It'll absorb the seed. It will travel somewhere else and deposit that seed with a great fertilizer and where it will flourish and grow. So it's a symbiotic relationship there. We didn't develop that with grains. And so the argument that we get against us is when you cook and process the grains, you remove all the anti-nutrients. And the argument I will make is actually that allowed us to fool ourselves and really have a negative impact on our health. Because if we didn't do that, we'd still be avoiding grains. You only have to eat them once to say, I'm never going to eat that again. We do cook most of those anti-nutrients out, but there's enough research showing that no, we don't cook it all out. And if anybody's interested, look up the two key anti-nutrients that you're going to see in grains are lectins and saponins. And then another one that you might be interested in that we've been breeding more and more into wheats is something called amylase trypsin inhibitors. And you can read about all these. Just go to Wikipedia. They've got good explanations of all these. But the problem is we cook enough out that it allows us to eat the food without getting violently sick. But we're still getting some of those anti-nutrients, which get into our system, and they have two main effects. One is they break down the digestive barrier, which is really critical to our health. So that allows a lot of things that should stay in our gut to get into our system, particularly a lot of gram-negative bacteria, a lot of LPS markers, which then cause inflammation. And wheat in particular, this was actually my thesis research with Dr. Cordain, is incredible at activating our immune system and causing this aberrant inflammation that we do not want that leads to a lot of chronic disease.
And why is that?
I will give you a very short explanation and please tell me where you want to dive in. But first of all, I'm going to start with most of the people listening, they know what macrophages are. There's a type of macrophage called a CD14 positive macrophage, which activates our immune system. Wheat has multiple ways of activating CD14 on macrophages, which then, like I said, gets the immune system going. The more, and I can dive more into that, like I said, I'm just trying to give you the short version. What's more important is a lot of them probably also know in our T cell system, there's a very important balance between what are called T regulatory cells and Th17 cells. T reg cells basically tamp down the immune system. They're designed to constantly tell the immune system, hey, this is food. This is our own body. Don't react to this. Don't ramp up. Stay down regulated. They have a balance with these Th17, which are highly inflammatory cell that do a lot of damage to our body. Th17 cells, the belief is they were designed to deal with bacterial invasion. So they do damage, but one of the worst things that can happen for us is for bacteria from our gut to get into our system. So our bodies basically say it's worth a little short-term damage to get rid of that bacterial invasion. A lot of these grains can flip that balance. In a healthy state, T regulatory cells dominate. What you see when people eat a lot of grains, particularly wheat, is that a flip in that balance where you start seeing chronically elevated Th17, which you don't want. So my research was on autoimmune disease. All autoimmune diseases are preceded by chronically elevated Th17. They're also showing that chronically elevated Th17 is associated with cancer, associated with heart disease, most of what we think of as the diseases of modern civilization.
And what is it about wheat that triggers that? Like, let's get down to the molecular level for those people who are listening who are going like, is it the gliadin?
So there's multiple ways. One, I mentioned the amylase trypsin inhibitors, which we are breeding more and more into wheat because they're a natural pesticide. So they were identified a few decades ago and went, well, this is great. It's natural pesticide, so let's breed wheat that's got more of this. The problem is amylase trypsin inhibitors activate dendritic cells, which live right along the gut barrier. Those dendritic cells then activate the CD14 positive macrophages, which then activate Th17. So that's one mechanism. Another key mechanism is gliadin, which is found in the gluten component of wheat, combine to the epithelial cells and release something called zonulin. And anybody who's interested in this, there's a researcher named Dr. Fasano who's done a ton of research on gliadin and zonulin. It's great research. But basically, when zonulin gets released, it causes an opening of the tight junctions in our gut. So for anybody who doesn't know this, all the epithelial cells in our gut are bound very closely to one another so that nothing in the gut can just pass in between. Zonulin breaks down the cytoskeleton between those cells and allows them to open up, which means the content of our gut can now actually get into circulation. So you start seeing some of that gram-negative bacteria get in that has LPS on it. LPS is a marker that, as soon as the immune system sees that, it activates the Th17 cells. And then the last thing, there's actually a molecule in gluten that has been called LPSW, which so it is part of the wheat, but it basically looks like LPS. And it activates the same thing as the LPS on gram-negative bacteria. Not as strongly as the bacteria does, but it still activates the same immune response, and that can elevate your Th17.
Wow, this is so cool. I'm so glad we got to this part. I didn't know about LPSW.
Yeah.
Is that newer research?
Well, I was writing about that in my thesis, and that was almost 20 years ago. So no, it's out there. But more and more research is coming out on it. And look, this was the short explanation. It gets a lot deeper and a lot more complex than this. But, as I said, my thesis was on the impact of wheat on autoimmune disease. And I remember, when I was a sports nutritionist, people would say, "Oh, I avoid gluten," and I would just go, "Oh, you're so stupid. There's no research on that. It's just media. Ignore that." By the time I was finished with my research, I just said, anybody who's like I was, who said there's no research in this, come talk to me. I've got about 400 studies. I mean, it was extraordinary, the amount of research.
And so as someone who has read these 400 studies on wheat, do you think that this is mostly because of the genetic modifications that we've done to wheat over the past, few decades? Or do you think that this is by its nature something that wheat does to the human body?
By its nature. Like I said, all these things were designed to protect the plant. And you eat that unprocessed wheat plant, you're going to get violently ill because of all this. By the way, the other thing I didn't cover was WGA, which is a lectin in gluten it's a heterodimer. It's got 10 binding sites. It actually has the ability to pass right through our epithelial cells, which nothing should have that ability, but it does. A lot of lectins have that ability to go through our epithelial cells. It can pull molecules in with it, and then it can bind to the basolateral side of the epithelial cells and activate our immune system. These things, the WGA, the LPSW, gliadin, they've all existed for millennia in the wheat plant. And like I said, actually what we've done is fooled ourselves where we cook most of it out so that we can actually consume this food and not get really sick. But there's still a little bit left. And that little bit over time elevates the immune system, causes that imbalance between Th17 and T regulatory cells that, again, isn't going to immediately cause autoimmune disease, isn't going to immediately cause heart disease, but over years leads to these chronic conditions. And so it fools us because you don't eat the food and then suddenly have an autoimmune condition or have heart disease and go, well, I'm never going to eat that food again. We can't do the association. We're really bad at saying, I've been eating this for years and now all of a sudden I'm discovering it's bad for me.
I think to your question, though, I would say it doesn't help. It does additional harm, right? When we know how grains, at least especially in the United States, historically, I don't want to lump all farm operations together, but many that, spray certain things right beforehand, that is just an added layer of chaos that gets wreaked within our system here. So it's both a yes and a no. To Trevor's point, but it definitely doesn't help, and it's causing an additional layer of chaos in the system.
This is so cool.
I'll give you another one because I know a food that's really popular now is quinoa, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And what I love, what you hear in the media is, well, it's really healthy for you because it's an ancient grain. And I still need somebody to explain that to me. What do you mean by an ancient grain? Wheat's been around 1 million years. It's an ancient grain too. But quinoa, so there's another anti-nutrient that you find in a lot of grains. It's called saponins. And saponin is just a Latin term for soap. It is literally soap. And what do you use soap for? If you get oily residue on your skin, you use soap. It foams, it breaks down those lipids and gets rid of the oily residue on your skin, which is great when you're trying to clean yourself. Though I will tell you, there are people in the paleo community who say that's actually bad for you. We need that lipid layer on our skin to protect us from any sort of invader. That's a different argument. But the key thing is saponins, when you consume them, they do exactly what soap does on your skin. It foams and it breaks down lipids. And the glycocalyx of our digestive system has a lipid bilayer that's designed to protect it because bacteria and other molecules can't get past that lipid bilayer. When you eat those saponins, they essentially punch holes in that lipid bilayer. So they help break down the protective barrier of your gut. Quinoa has the highest concentrations of saponins of any food by an order of magnitude.
Wow. I believe it.
Something I love to talk to people about because we always get that you're eliminating foods. And one of the criticisms you always hear of the paleo diet is, how are you going to get the nutrients that you need if you keep eliminating these foods? So Dr. Cordain and I actually wrote an article where we took the various food groups and ranked them in terms of nutrient density. And let's see if I can do this by memory. But from most nutrient dense to least nutrient dense, you have at the top of the list vegetables, then seafood, then fruit, then lean meats, then eggs, then legumes. And a lot of people don't know this, legumes and vegetables are not the same thing. I keep telling my mom because she loves to cook dinner for me. And she goes, Trevor, I cooked a ton of vegetables. I'm like, Mom, there's no vegetables there. But anyway, we got legumes towards the bottom of the list. And then the very bottom of the list is dairy, grains, nuts, and seeds. So the only food at the bottom of the list that's part of the paleo diet is nuts and seeds. And anybody who has an autoimmune condition, we generally tell them to remove it. There's actually essential nutrients in nuts, but they're so calorically dense. That's why they're at the bottom of the list. So the point that we always try to make is you're eliminating two food groups that are very, very low nutrient density. You have to replace those calories somehow. And if you're replacing it with calories from fruits, vegetables, fish, and meats, you're actually getting more nutrient dense food. So you're going to end up eating a more nutrient dense diet.
Brilliant. I am curious about, let's talk about legumes and why they're not vegetables and sort of, I think most people think, well, I can get behind, eating all the things that kind of naturally occur on the planet. Well, beans naturally occur, lentils naturally occur, sweet potatoes. Are those things you typically included in a paleo diet in large amounts? And if not, what's the science behind why we're leaving them out?
Yep. Well, so one thing to remember is beans are from the Americas. So we weren't exposed to them until fairly recently. And they have some of the same issues as grains. If you tried to eat a raw bean, you'd get very sick. So to process beans, you have to put them soak them in water for 24 hours. So beans are also very high in saponins. They also have lectins in them, so they have a lot of anti-nutrients in them. And it's the same thing. We have to soak them in water for a long time and then cook them for them to be edible. So they have the same issue of grains where they have to be processed for us to be able to consume them. All this being said, the thing I always try to tell people is foods are not black and white. It's not a food is entirely good for you, entirely bad for you. It's on a spectrum. And if you ask me to place beans on that spectrum, it'd be somewhere in the middle. I'm not going to say they're really good for you. I'm not going to say they're really bad for you. I don't, if I'm doing a vegetable medley and there's beans in there, I'm going to eat them. I'm not going to try to pick them out like I would some other foods. But you do have to be careful, particularly if you have autoimmune conditions or other issues. It might be something you want to experiment with taking out of your diet. And the other thing with beans versus vegetables, as I said, legumes are much further down on the nutrient density scale. You're going to get a lot more of the nutrients you need from eating vegetables than you are from eating beans. The one benefit to beans, particularly for people who are vegan, is they're one of your few plant sources that has a good, proper mix of amino acids.
Yeah. I think one thing, and I'm such a stickler, this is kind of my sandbox to play in, is identifying that we're not big proponents of any type of logical fallacy here. And so what I don't want to be picked at Trevor's words here is oh, well, beans are a certain way, so you need to have it processed. They need something before they can enter the body. Same thing could be said about meats, right? Oh, you have to cook it before this. So I want to make sure that the argument doesn't get twisted across all different foods. But there's, to Trevor's point, each food item has a specific thing that needs to happen here. So that it is specific to beans and it is a specific type of argument with wheat. We're not going to carry that same argument over to meat and to seafood. And the same thing, I know that raw dairy is a hot topic right now. So one could make the case of well, it came from an animal and there's no processing. We are not sitting here promoting raw dairy either. So I just want to make sure that for clinicians hearing this, and we had an interview on ultra processed foods recently, and I made a comment, and I wish I could go back and tweak it, just that it's not always a surefire bet that just because something has little to no processing that that immediately should be eaten that way. So we need to be carry that argument over wisely, very specifically.
I think that's a good point. I mean, and you bring up raw dairy. Dairy was where I was going to go next. So we talked a lot about the anti-nutrients and the lectins and how those are kind of common threads that led us through grains and beans and legumes. Why is dairy not included in the paleo diet?
A lot of reasons. I'll start with one, and then I'm sure Griffin will jump on some of the others. So remember, dairy is designed to help infants grow. Obviously, it makes sense that in ancient times, you didn't have adults consuming dairy because you couldn't go to a store and just buy it. And Dr. Cordain always loves to show a picture of an auroch, which was the ancestors of cows, which was a much bigger, nastier animal, and said, "Do you want to try to milk this?" You wouldn't. We didn't have dairy until you had domestication. But here's the really interesting, kind of neat thing about dairy and evolution. I know people talk about, oh, they're adding all these hormones to dairy. That's not really true. The hormones were already there. Food wasn't, calories weren't always readily available in ancient times the way they are now. So you didn't want an infant growing unless you had the calories in order to grow this infant. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a neat trick that a lot of the growth hormone that an infant needs to grow was actually in the mother's milk. And the mother would only produce those growth hormones if she was getting enough calories. So it was basically her body's way of saying, I am consuming enough calories so that this infant can grow. So now I'm going to produce the growth hormones and let the infant grow. And if they were in caloric scarcity, if they were in a starvation state, the infant would grow much, much slower. So it's actually a neat evolutionary trick to say, we're going to put the growth hormone in the dairy. So it's already there. And the problem that we have with consuming dairy is we are getting growth hormone that, A, we shouldn't be getting as adults. B, it's not even human growth hormone. It's cow's growth hormone. It's not healthy for us, and it can have a lot of negative consequences. So that's one. So another thing I'll throw at you with dairy that will probably surprise a lot of people, but there's a ton of research on this. They're very, we always talk about getting enough calcium, getting enough of this nutrient or that nutrient, but what's actually more important is the ratios. And one of the critical ratios in our diet is the calcium to magnesium ratio. We need to consume right around 2-to-1 calcium to magnesium. If you get way below that, that's associated with heart disease, but way above that is really associated with heart disease. And what you're seeing in America, particularly with women, because a lot of women are taking calcium supplements to avoid osteoporosis, you're seeing them consuming 4-to-1 to 5-to-1. Dairy is a factor in that because there's a lot of calcium in dairy. There's almost no magnesium. So you're getting a really bad ratio. And this is one of the explanations for the rise in heart disease. And that really bad ratio of calcium and magnesium is one of the explanations. And please, anybody listening to this, look this up. You will find hundreds of studies. Women are about matched with men in heart disease now. 50, 60 years ago, heart disease was mostly a male disease. And this is being attributed to the bad calcium to magnesium ratio. And so, I'm sure the question now is, well, with these women with osteoporosis, how do you deal with that? How are they going to get their calcium? And that's another thing that, again, look this up. There are hundreds of studies. Really, calcium supplementation has very little impact on osteoporosis. That's not the issue. It's not the consumption. It's the excretion. And one of the biggest factors in osteoporosis is actually eating an acidic diet. Because what's the best source of base in your body? It's calcium. Like you take a Tums when your stomach is acidic, Tums is just calcium. And so your body does the same thing internally. If you are eating a diet that's acidic, so meaning that it causes a drop in the pH of your blood, you're going to start leaching calcium from your bones to get the pH back up. One of the biggest factors in this goes back to our salt sugar conversation, is sodium-potassium ratio. And if you want, I can explain the science behind that. You're shaking your head. So yes, so every doctor will know this. We have sodium-potassium pumps throughout our body. When you are at rest, 25% of your energy is going into powering those sodium-potassium pumps. And they get sodium out of your cells and put potassium in your cells, which is the natural state. That's where we want to be. If you are eating a diet that's very high in sodium and low in potassium, you start running into an issue that your body doesn't have enough potassium to get the sodium out of the cells. So there's a secondary transporter that transports the sodium out of the cells with a hydrogen ion. And for anybody who knows their acid chemistry, hydrogen ions, that's just acid. We have all these different names for these different acids, but ultimately it's just their ability to release hydrogen ions. So to get the sodium out of your cells, with a secondary mechanism, we're constantly pumping hydrogen ions into the blood, which is dropping the pH. So you'll be in a constant acidic state and leaching calcium from your bones. And that's one of the major causes of osteoporosis. So they've now done multiple studies where they've taken osteoporotic women, either taken them off of their calcium supplement completely and put them on a potassium supplement or add a potassium supplement. And when they get their sodium-potassium ratio in balance, you start seeing them actually regrowing bone tissue.
I actually want to know, especially Trevor, because you are an athlete.
Yes.
How do you feel about all these like mega doses of sodium that we see our elite athletes relying on now in electrolyte supplements?
To a degree, it's killing me. So, this. Griffin's part of this. We have our own podcast for our other business called Fast Talk, which is about the science of endurance sports. And I have been fighting a bit the trend that you are seeing in sports nutrition, which is we literally had somebody come on our show and say, simple sugar is good for you, which just dropped my jaw. But that is a lot of the mentality in sports nutrition. And they're very big on trying to get more and more sugar per hour in your system. But the other one is more and more sodium. And I think, yes, if you are doing a really hard race in a really hot environment, you probably need a little more sodium, but I think we are going overboard. And something I will point out, again, look this up. There's a ton of research on this and what they're calling the third compartment in our skin epithelial cells. So when we consume too much sodium, our body can't excrete all of it. Our kidneys only have so much ability. So you end up with too much sodium in your body, and we need to do something with it. And so what they're finding is there are storage compartments in our epithelial cells. In the epithelial cells of our venous system or atria, sorry, why am I blanking on the term? Anyway.
Arterial space?
Thank you. That ultimately can lead to atherosclerosis if you get too much sodium storage there. But the other epithelial cells you see a lot of sodium get stored in is our skin. And that can lead to premature wrinkling because they've shown that when the sodium is stored in the skin.
I want to talk through kind of like what improvements in health do people see? I would assume based on everything we just talked about, that you would see people see an improvement in autoimmunity, in hypertension, in inflammatory conditions, in food sensitivities. You guys, I'm sure, have thousands, maybe tens of thousands of case studies at this point, because I know you also have a community of folks that you're talking to all the time. What happens when somebody goes on a paleo diet? What sort of changes in their health might we see?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to look at this. One, about what we endorse is someone taking slow steps to make a goal of living an 85-15 lifestyle. So 85% of the time you're eating within the paleo dietary guidelines, and then the other 15 you're kind of living your life and you're not stressing about it. For those who go cold turkey, you're going to experience one type of transition, right? And you'll notice health benefits kind of roll out a little bit differently. For those who take those gradual baby steps, that transition may take a lot longer of a time. You may not notice things as immediately. And so I think those are two things you should be prepared when talking to a patient, so that we're not setting up someone to be searching for a sign, not getting it, and then saying it's just not for me. Right. So you really want to make sure you're setting up someone for success by what to expect, and not making these really grandiose promises of you're going to start to feel this right away, because actually the people who commit toward this lifestyle a little bit more fully from the get-go tend to actually feel a little bit crummier, like I said earlier, initially. And that might even take up to a few weeks, at least in a lot of people's experiences. We just had an employee the other day who was saying like, I'm going to do 10 days of going paleo. I'm going to really commit to it. I want to do this kind of as a research project for some of the demographics that we serve. And by the time I think she got to the end of 10 days, this is when her kind of peak physiological frustration kind of took effect, right? This is sometimes impacting your mood. It might start to impact where your body is doing that last like craving desperation of like, oh, I would just do anything for like, I would lick a deer salt lick right now, right? Like anything that you're kind of craving for. And then one of the things we had a conversation, that whole 10-day period kind of culminated at our holiday party. And so we had this conversation with her about if you had actually done more than 10 days, like right now is when it would start to feel good or you'd start to notice those benefits. So I think we should set patients up for understanding like which route do you want to take? Do you want to take the baby steps and you want to habit stack and you want to, start taking some of these things day by day? Or do you want to kind of cold turkey this lifestyle? And again, not to use the cheat day concept, but you want to kind of do the 6 days on, 7th day off type of thing. So setting someone up for appropriate expectations. And then a few things that you'll start to notice from the beginning. One, a lot of people will start to notice that they don't need certain extremes to regulate their energy. So they don't always need as much coffee or caffeine to get going. They don't need as much during the day to kind of pick them up. And they don't need something to help sedate them as much at night. So your energy throughout the day tends to be a little bit more consistent and less rise and fall. And that's for a variety of things. One, you're probably sleeping better. Two, because you're not introducing as much sugar into the system. You're not having these spikes and energy crashes throughout the day. So you're not roller coastering. So that's a pretty strong recommendation for those who are kind of at the peak of their career and they really need to be able to rely on this without introducing 5 espressos throughout the day. So energy, better sleep is what we notice as well. One thing that, Trevor's deep dive earlier really hammered home was the introduction of bacteria into the system and kind of what happens across our immune system, the really building blocks of our immune system. So people tend to have stronger immunity. They're not necessarily getting sick as much. That one you have to put an asterisk in because everyone's immune system is a little bit different, but we do notice that. Cardiovascular health. So that there is this, I love talking about this because the patients that I've worked with, even, the family members, when they start to eating this way, they feel like they have this little pep in their step. And so their exercise, their stamina tends to be a little bit better as well, where they're not feeling like they're lugging their body along around a track. There's just this kind of, there's increased stamina, that's for sure. There are some really fun articles about this type of dietary lifestyle and sexual performance. That's a fun one we introduce and roll out around Valentine's Day. Always a crowd favorite. So that one definitely exists. Neurological functions. If you look at it less as like it's this single, dimension intervention that comes in and does all these specific things, I would reframe it that eating this way and living in this lifestyle, to your point, the very beginning of the show, it's not just about what's on your plate. It's about how you're eating, the relationship you have with your food, an active lifestyle as well. But all of this creates a different set of reactions that happen in your body at the most, cellular level. And because of that, your body is able to change across multiple systems, across multiple functions and multiple benefits. So when we're explaining this to patients, I think it's really important to come at it from that direction rather than going down the route that sometimes we've seen, and I've worked in this industry, in the supplement industry or something else, like this is good for X, Y, Z, and this is the impact. It makes people think, it propagates this silver or this magic bullet effect. If I do this, it's this particular thing. Instead, it's saying, if I eat within this lifestyle, if I shop at the perimeter of the grocery store, I'm setting up my body for success to handle what's coming its way and for a diet that's really aligned with living a long, healthy, strong life. And that's where I would focus it for. It does help people if they understand, like, okay, I have arthritis and I have chronic pain. I have these different things. If I eat this way, it's going to reduce that. So you can go at it that way. And that's another health benefit, right? Chronic pain and inflammatory, joint conditions as well. But I think that's, again, setting up someone for success during the onset and what to expect. You might get cranky. You might get a little sassy with your partner. You might start to get a little hankering for some things. And you might feel like a rabid animal during that period. You might have a little bit of an energy crash in those first few days or even the first couple of weeks because your body's used to being manipulated in that way with its energy. Like something's always there to bring it back to this place. So you might feel kind of crappy depending on how hard or how strong you commit to. And then over time, you'll feel less intense. So it kind of brings you overall, and this can be with mood, this can be with pain, this can be with energy. Instead of living life in the extremes, we're living life in a little bit more of a narrow, enjoyable window that's easier to mitigate and less like you have to rely on things. So that's how I'd sum it up.
So, the only thing I'm going to add to this, which is kind of a summary of this, is to actually address one of the biggest myths that we hear about the paleo diet. This idea that hunter-gatherer societies all died of old age when they were 40. So why would we want to live like them? That's not true at all. What you're looking at there is average age of death, and it doesn't factor in cause of death. And yes, in hunter-gatherer times, there was a lot of death before the age of 2, unfortunately. And that brought the average age down. So what's more important to look at is modal age of death. And when you look at hunter-gatherer societies, their modal age of death is the age at which you saw the most frequent deaths. Modal age of death in hunter-gatherer societies was right around 72, 73. Modal age of death now is about 75, 76. And when you think back then, you broke a leg, you weren't going to survive that. You couldn't just go to the hospital. There were a lot of viruses that killed people that we didn't have vaccines for. You look at all the advantages that we have now. We also live in heated homes. They were exposed to the environment. The fact that our modal age of death is only a couple years higher with all the advantages we have is actually kind of a negative statement on us. And what you saw when, European explorers started going to the other continents and encountering hunter-gatherer societies for the first time, what they were always shocked by was how strong and robust even the elderly were. So what we think of as normal aging actually isn't normal aging. Normal aging is we lose a little strength, we lose a little speed, but we stay very healthy, very robust for most of our life. And then that age of morbidity where we start to see disease really only hits us a year or two before age of morbidity. And that's not the way it is now. Now it's age of morbidity is in our 30s and 40s. And we have several decades before age of mortality.
I think this is great. I mean, it sounds like if you want to give your patient, because look, the paleo diet, it's not just an idea. It's not just a set of rules. The whole reason we have you guys here is that you've now spent years and years and years developing tools to help people consume a diet that is rich in naturally occurring foods, low in foods that have anti-nutrients that harm gut health that we know are inflammatory. And so for any doctor who wants to encourage their clients to eat a more healthful diet, a more health promoting diet, knowing that you guys have so many tools to make it easy is a brilliant resource. And so, I mean, I was following you guys on Instagram. I saw a video of Dr. Griffin making this like delicious looking pie. Like using apple, walnut. There's so much that you have in abundance on this diet that is delicious and filling and health promoting. And you have so many tools that actually make it easy for people to do this versus just trying to tell your client, go home and, eat less inflammatory foods. That never, ever, ever works. So talk to us about the resources that you have for folks who are looking to live a more paleo lifestyle.
Absolutely. That's actually the biggest consideration that we have is seeking out what are these pain points, what are these things that are holding people back or getting in their way from being able to live a life that's congruent with these dietary lifestyle or this dietary lifestyle. And so we've built out these resources and have so many exciting ones coming out in 2025. And I think so many of our resources play at the individual level and are great. So we have things like a 7-day meal plan and guide that help you like, okay, if you're going to do the same thing as one of our team members, I'm going to do this for a week. I'm just going to see what this looks like. We've got something for you there. The 14-day meal plan. So if you want to do 2 weeks, and these things all have not only the guidelines and the information for patients, they have grocery lists. So exactly what you need to send yourself or a loved one to the store so they can't get lost. We even label what sections of the grocery store to find these items in. And if you're a person like my mother, you will appreciate being able to send someone to the store with that. We have the recipe instructions. There's always a photo to help you understand what it should look like at the end. There are tips. And then we have a 28-day. So if you're saying, okay, I really think I'm only going to have the benefits if I stick to this for 30 days, or for a month, we have a 28-day meal plan with the grocery list, with everything else. And these always take into consideration, how can I reuse the leftovers of something, right? So we have that as well. We also have how to stock a paleo pantry, and that helps you kind of go in at certain times of the year and say, okay, is there anything in here that I can donate or responsibly dispose of and replace with a better alternative? Or is there a way I can reimagine some of these staple dishes within my, family traditions by stocking something a little bit differently? So we can tackle that. We have resources about how to properly store things in your fridge, how to freeze meats and reuse them. Again, going back to, are we respecting someone's time? Are we respecting someone's budget and the diversity in both in the lifestyle? So some are retirees and empty nesters and going through things like menopause. Some are 3 kids in different schools and another baby on the way, and they have to think about the mental load that them and their partner or them on their own has in feeding an entire family and, addressing picky eaters and all the different things. So what we have coming out in 2025 are specifically some resources for providers, not just for the individuals. And so if anyone has specific resources we get that they need, email us. We get these emails from providers and major clinics from time to time, and we would love to see how we can support you.
Griffin touched on something that I would love to make my final message, which is we are very big on celebrating successes. And this is something I got from, I was a cycling coach for years. And I have coached athletes who have gone to the Tour de France. I have coached athletes that just bought their first bike. And when that athlete who just bought their first bike goes and does their first 20-mile ride, I don't sit there and go, well, so what? My tour guide just rode 100 miles. We celebrate it. We make a big deal. You just did your first 20-mile ride. That's a big deal. And that's really how we want to help people with diet. It's not, you now have to be a Nazi. You have to eat paleo 100%. If you are eating nothing but junk and you go to the supermarket and buy some mangoes and some broccoli, we're going to celebrate that. And the hope is over time, you do your first 20-mile ride. Then maybe you do your first 40-mile ride, and it's progressive. But you get to the point you want. And look, if somebody wants to be absolutely committed, with the tour athletes, that's your whole lifestyle is getting ready for the tour. And you have to be dedicated. I'm going to support them on that. But they made the choice to say, I want to go to the Tour de France. I would never impose that on anybody. So it's really about helping people get to where they want to get to.
I know, your athleticism is super important to you, and that's how you found this lifestyle. And I know what continues to fuel you. How did you come to this?
Yeah, so you're right. I was a professional cyclist for years, and I ate a traditional sports nutrition, high sugar, high salt diet. And I retired when I was 38 because I was just getting sick all the time. And couldn't figure out why I was getting sick. The doctors couldn't figure out why I was getting sick. And I just went, I'm just getting old. I can't handle this sort of level of training. So I went back to school, went to CSU, and one of my first classes was with Dr. Cordain. And having learned traditional sports nutrition, I sat there in the class and I was angry. I was like, this guy's full of it. Could not believe what he was saying. Was so angry. I spent the summer after that class trying to prove him wrong. And in the course of trying to prove him wrong, I'd go through the science and go, well, that makes sense. But this can't be right. And then I'd go through the science and go, well, actually, that makes sense too. And slowly over time, I ended up on the paleo diet without even knowing it. And that winter was the winter I was, so I was 38. And all of a sudden, I wasn't getting sick anymore. And even though I was a full-time student, I was training better and harder than I had in years. I went to Canadian Nationals on my 39th birthday and missed third place by a wheel length. And actually, the next year, went back to racing pro. And briefly that year, I was ranked, at the age of 40, I was ranked top 10 in America. And, I'm not as fast as I used to be, but, I did a professional race down in the Caribbean 2 months ago at the age of 53. So that, for me, the evidence of the diet for me, and that was entirely the diet. It gave me many more years of being able to race, of being healthy, of just no longer having all these illness issues. That turned me into the convert. And that's why this is my diet for the rest of my life.
There's one scientifically inaccurate thing that's been shared on this podcast episode, and it's that someone just said that 38 is old. And
sorry.
If we could redact that for all scientists who are hearing this, 38 is not old. That's the only incorrect.
Old for a professional athlete. How about that?
I want to hear it. I'm nearly there. I think for me, Dr. Kresge, I grew up really loving nature and really loving my time spent in it. And I loved Whole Foods and grew up with a father that really loved to cook. I noticed how much community it happens with food at the epicenter. And so what does that mean for a culture over time? And what are the ripple effects of that, depending on how we relate to our food and what we eat and how we use it to heal and how we use it to celebrate? And so when I think about that and how much I love our world and our planet, and I want to take care of it too, I wanted to find a lifestyle or a dietary lifestyle that could be as flexible as possible, that could be so kind to the earth, that could be something that feels like a tool belt that people have, when they're grocery shopping at the farmer's market or from, a big supermarket store, and they say, okay, this is the way I want to live my life today or this week. I have a lot of workouts, or I know that the flu season is coming up, and I know that that they have enough education in their mind to go, I'm going to look at this as both as my playpen, as a tool belt, as a food pharmacy, and that they can live their lives with intention. Again, because of what I studied in undergrad, I had a variety of different thoughts about the paleo diet when I sat down and interviewed with Trevor at our first conversation. And I think the thing that ended up selling me to say I'd like to be a part of this company and this initiative that they have is, one, there's this massive community who thinks they know what paleo is around the world that I could have an opportunity to support, which is really meaningful to me. But second was that Trevor was willing to be proven wrong in the first conversation I had with him, which showed me a responsibility to science and a responsibility to individual and population health over ego or over a trademark. It was, this is our responsibility. And that was something as far as integrity that I could align with. And then lastly, just knowing that we could create resources that would benefit so many different conditions.
Well, I think people have already fallen in love with you both listening to this podcast. And so I want to thank you each for all of your time today. And I want to point people to where they can continue to learn from you. Where can people find more of you both?
The Paleo Diet, super simple. Thepaleodiet.com. We have an awesome newsletter that you should sign up for in 2025. Cool things are coming. Our socials are either The Paleo Diet or Real Paleo Diet. You all know how it is securing a handle. And we're pretty much across every platform you can imagine and have some really fun media appearances coming through. So that's The Paleo Diet. Trevor?
Yeah. So our other business is Fast Talk Labs, which, like I said, is focused on the science of endurance sports training. We have a podcast called Fast Talk, hence the name of the business. And I will tell you, actually, one of the biggest compliments I ever received is when we learned that about 10 to 15% of our audience is MDs who aren't athletes, who come to our podcast just to get their science. So I will warn you, it's not a Science Light podcast, but if people enjoy that, please come and listen.
And occasionally they come for the witty banter of
That
me
too.
and three grown men just absolutely roasting one another.
I love that. We're going to have the whole team back to talk about elite performance. Because you span so many different topics in science. It's impossible to cover it in one episode. I'm really grateful that you guys came here today to talk about the paleo diet. Thank you, Dr. Griffin McMath and Trevor Connor, for all of your time.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.